names like Slowy, Little Canoe Channel, Atsafchu, Brush Spread on the Water, and Dukwik, Place of the Fish Spear. I use the word town because these weren't small, transient villages. They were all permanently occupied sites consisting of several large wooden longhouses with populations ranging anywhere from several dozen to a couple hundred. These were centers of resource gathering and distribution, political and kinship networks, spiritual life, trade, diplomacy, and so on. Their streets bustled with life and activity of all sorts. Artwork, canoe and totem pole carving, gambling and games, dances and ceremonies, births, marriages, funerals, etc. Again, you can learn more about pre-contact life in my Northwest Coast culture video. In their own language, the Duwamish call themselves the Dukdo'ak, meaning people of the interior. The name references the fact that, unlike many other Lushootseed-speaking tribes whose principal settlements were along the shorelines of the Sound, most Duwamish lived a bit inland, either along the Duwamish River and its upstream tributaries, namely the Black, White, and Cedar Rivers, or along the shores of the lakes and protected bays of Seattle, namely Salmon Bay and Lake Washington. The modern Duwamish are actually composed of what used to be three closely related groups, though each with distinct names. The name Dukdo'ak referred chiefly to the people who settled in the Duwamish Valley along the riverways. Then there were the Cutdo'ak, the lake people. This was the name used by those whose settlements drained the shores of Lake Washington. The third and smallest group called themselves the Shulshulaj, the people of tucked away inside. They lived in what is now the Ballard, Green Lake, Interbay neighborhoods, and their name derived from their sole principal settlement called Shulshul that stood on the west end of what is today Salmon Bay. Yes, that is the origin of the place named Shilshul. The shared experiences with white colonization over the last 150 years drew these three groups even closer together than they already were, resulting in the loss of the regional distinctions. Unfortunately, by the mid-19th century, diseases introduced since the start of the fur trade had already taken their toll on the local population. Some towns, including Zizalali, had been entirely abandoned, but the place name was not forgotten. When the white colonists first arrived in 1851 to establish a city, they wound up making two. They first set up shop across the bay at Alki Beach. Don't worry, we'll visit there in a second. They quickly found that location inadequate, however, and the following spring in 1852 came over here and chose the site of the former Zizalal Beach as the permanent location for their city. Thus, most Duwamish applied the old name to the whites' settlement. Thus, to this day in Lushootseed, the modern city of Seattle is still referred to as Zizalal Beach. Seattle, known by the Duwamish as Spotkelbox, or Prairie Point. This is where, on November 13, 1851, Arthur Denny and 23 other colonists originally came ashore to establish an Anglo city in what would become Seattle. Through numerous retellings and frequent reenactments, this event has gained legendary status as a sort of origin myth for the city. To hear some people tell it, that day was nothing less than the fulfillment of American destiny. From the settlement of Jamestown and Plymouth to civilization's indomitable march across the plain, everything culminated here in the establishment of the imperial city of the Pacific. Predictably, the Duwamish are portrayed as playing only a minor part in the tale, if even mentioned at all. Now, this story tells us more about how white Seattleites saw themselves than anything about the actual event. If we take a step back and look at it from an indigenous perspective, we can place it in its proper historical context. To start, the Denny Party were not the first white people to have traversed through the Puget Sound region. The fur trade had been alive and well since the 1790s. The Hudson's Bay Company had been operating Fort Nisqually 50 miles to the south since 1832. Nor were they the first colonists to establish a city in the region. On the southern tip of Puget Sound, Olympia had been established 5 years earlier in 1846. Nor were they even the first colonists to arrive in Seattle. They were beaten by a month by a separate party of 4 who had spent the meantime living in a Duwamish town of 700 inhabitants, I might add. Nor was this the party's originally intended destination. They had departed from Illinois and taken the overland route to Portland, originally meaning to settle in Oregon's Willamette Valley. But upon arrival, they were told in Portland, here I am paraphrasing, "Oregon be full, go north." Thus they headed for Puget Sound. Upon arrival, the foreigners were greeted by a large party of Duwamish. Not because the Duwamish were unfamiliar with and surprised by the whites, but because they were very familiar with them and had expected them. The Welcome Committee was headed by someone who has been even more mythologized than these first white colonists, Chief Siak. Siak was a man of mixed Duwamish and Seconic heritage. The Seconics lived just across the Sound on the Kitsap Peninsula side of the water. Siak was already a respected and accomplished Duwamish leader in his 70s by the time Denny's party arrived. He had been a lauded warrior and equally capable peacetime manager. And by all accounts, even in his old age, he was a very physically fit and imposing figure. Over 6 feet in height with broad shoulders, a booming voice,